Welcome back to Module 5. This is segment 5.4, Growing and Scaling Your Business. All right, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to discuss different aspects of growth, including how to keep track of your growth, knowing when to pivot. What does pivoting mean? What are the different stages of growth and the challenges of growth? What does it mean to scale up your business? And to think about your team and your organizational growth, and then finally, your managerial focus versus your founder focus once you get to be of a certain size. So as we just mentioned, we're going to talk about different ways of measuring growth. Now, there are lots of different aspects to think about when you're measuring growth, and I've sketched out a few things here that you can think about. Now, not every single business is going to use every single one of these things. But, try and adapt this list to your own circumstances. So, obviously the quickest and easiest way to think about growth is how many total users are you serving? How many people have signed up to use your service? How many people are your customers overall, your overall customer base? And then we have total active users, because in some cases people might sign up for a service, but then they may not actually go and use the service once they've signed up. So we want to keep track of both total users, which is everyone who signed up somehow, and total active users, and those are the people who are coming back every once in a while to use your service. Okay, then we have total paying customers. So here we have to think about the business model a little bit. Who are your customers? Who are the users? They may not be the same people. Who is paying for the service that you're offering or the product? And in which case you want to track how many paying customers do you have. Total revenues, that's pretty obvious. We talked about that a lot in the last module. Then we have the couple of things that are new here, which are a little bit interesting. Conversion rate of free to paying users. So in other words, in some businesses, you might offer something for free just to get it off the ground, to build a user base or to get some initial customers so that you can then tell everyone you have more customers, et cetera. So you may offer some things for free at first, or you may have a sort of freemium model. Freemium models where you have different types of services. You have the free service, which is the basic service, and then people who want more can pay for more, the so-called premium people. So the question is, what percentage of those people that start out free switch to paying? And you might want to track that over time. A churn rate is when you have customers who come and go, and they are your customer for a while, then they leave. And so you want to track how many customers, what percentage of your customers actually leave and quit the system somehow. And then finally, the last item here is customer acquisition payback period. So it might cost you something. It will cost you something to acquire customers. And so the question that you have to ask yourself is, well, how much does it cost for me to get a customer versus how much do I gain from the customer? Assuming you have some kind of, for example, a subscription model or something like that where someone pays for unlimited usage of some product or service, then the question is, if it costs you, $100 to acquire the customer and the person pays $10 a month, that means it's going to take you 10 months just to pay back the initial cost to recoup the initial cost of acquiring that customer. So basically what I'm asking you to do here is with the growth metrics is to kind of track these things for your business, adapt this for the kind of business that you have, and then track these over time to see how things are working out. Tracking those growth metrics will help you decide whether you need to pivot. Now, pivoting is a term that people use when you change one or more aspects of your business model. So you're going to make some changes here, and you need to understand those growth metrics to decide whether you need to make some changes. Okay? Now, certain schools of thought say that you should use the following method for pivoting. And here what you have is rapid prototyping. So you want to come up with something relatively quickly that you can show and demonstrate to other people. And that might lead to a so-called minimum viable product. Minimum viable product basically means it's the smallest unit that you need to have no extra bells and whistles that you can show. Okay, so it's like your first prototype, or you could be your second or third prototype as well. But you're going to pull together a kind of a product that's good for demonstration purposes. And then you want to immediately elicit feedback from potential customers, potential users, other ecosystem participants, the whole supply chain. You should demonstrate and show this to people, and you should get feedback. And then you need to revisit your assumptions. And if something is not working, then you need to make adjustments. Now, some people make a distinction. They draw a distinction between a small adjustment, and which could be called an iteration or something like that, and a large adjustment, which could be called a pivot. But in any case, if something isn't working, and also your growth metrics that I just showed you will also inform that, then you need to make some kind of adjustment, and that adjustment is usually called some kind of pivot. And then what you want to do is an iterative process. You want to repeat those steps until you come up with something that works for you and works for the people that you've demonstrated. So in other words, it's a successful idea, successful product or service. Okay, given what we just discussed, you may ask yourself, when should I pivot? And the answer to that question is a little bit complex because there's no one answer saying, oh, you must pivot now. But what I've done here is I've drawn up a little laundry list of items that you should consider before pivoting. Okay, so if you've made some big assumptions about your market, about what customers like or need, when your primary assumptions are wrong, so you're being confronted in the prior slide with something, with feedback that says, gee, I thought people would pay for this, or other aspects of it, then you have to say, okay, my primary assumption was wrong. I might need to think about something different here. I might need to modify what I'm doing. And there are different variations of this in my list here. Customers have different needs than what you thought. That's one assumption that you make. You could have other assumptions about demographics, et cetera, but customers is a big one. And if you find out that they have different needs than what you thought, then that's a very clear signal that you may want to pivot. If your environment is changing, what does that mean, environment changing? Well, what that means is, example, you have new competition. Some well-funded competitor enters the same space that you're in. When new regulations are introduced or other sort of government interventions. If macroeconomics changes are taking place. So in other words, if there's a recession that's starting after you started your company, or a giant boom, so people have more money to spend, that's also something that calls you to rethink what you're doing. The key one here, when no one wants to pay for your product. I think this is a very common one, actually, either directly or indirectly. In other words, you're trying to sell your product and people don't want to buy it. You try and make money from, say, advertising and getting some kind of indirect payment for your product, and no one wants to pay for advertising. So that's a very clear signal, something about the customers and something about your product offering that you might want to rethink. Or another very common one, when your sales cycles are too long. So in other words, you thought you would be able to get out there and sell these things right away, that people would jump on, and it turns out that you need to really, really talk and educate your customers for a very long time before they're willing to actually pay. So some aspects here, and you can have other aspects too, but these are things that cause you to rethink what you're doing and make you wonder whether or not there are certain aspects of your product, your service, value proposition, your partnerships, etc., that you may want to rethink. So once you've arrived at something that works for you, you've pivoted to the point where you think you've got a good idea and it seems to be working well, you may want to think about scale. So what does scaling mean? Scaling is achieving a higher sales volume using the same infrastructure. Okay? So in other words, if you have one salesperson and that person goes out and gets customers for you, and that person can get one customer and may take a year to get that first customer. And then to get a second customer, that person would have to spend another year to get a second. So that's not a very scalable business in some sense, right? If you have to hire a new person to get another customer, then that's not achieving high scale. So scale is really thinking about bringing your sales volume up using the same infrastructure that you have so that one salesperson may be able to get 10 customers or 100, 1,000, or 1,000,000 customers. Okay, so what does it take to achieve scale? Well, the first thing it takes is a back end that works efficiently. So back end is something that the customer doesn't see. So it could be order fulfillment, and delivery, etc. Those kinds of things need to be ready for high volume. You need to understand the potential size of the market and think about how big it is. And then having the marginal cost of gaining more sales be relatively low. So in other words, using that example of the salespeople, if you need to hire a new person for every customer that you have, then that's obviously not a very scalable business because your marginal cost of gaining an additional customer is very, very, very high. Okay, so you might want to think about how low you can bring down that marginal cost. You need to be not very labor intensive for gaining new customers, which is related to the next point, which is knowing the whole sales cycle. How long do people need to think before they're willing to actually pay for the product or service that you've got in mind here? Furthermore, you have to design the product or service and market the product or service with large numbers in mind. So not a one-off type thing. Of course, in the prototyping phase, no problem. But then when you get to the scale phase, then you want to make sure that your product can handle multiple users at the same time, multiple customers. Same thing with marketing to them. And then we're going to talk about this a little bit more, is making sure the organization itself can handle growth. In other words, what kind of organization do you need to be able to gain large sales volume? Okay, here's a little warning for you here. This is a very interesting quote. Startups need 2 to 3 times longer to validate their market than most founders expect. This underestimation creates the pressure to scale prematurely. I think this is very good words of wisdom here, because I've seen it myself in different ventures. Validating your market takes a while. Trying to understand where you're going to end up and pivoting to the right place takes some time. And then when you have the pressure to scale prematurely, that means you're not ready for the scale. And that means you're either not going to achieve it, or even if you somehow manage to get all these customers, you're going to disappoint them because you're not going to be ready to handle them. So either way, be warned that there is a time lag here to validate the market, and then you want to go ahead and go for the scale. All right, let's look at this model, Greiner model of startup growth. This is a very interesting and insightful work. Basically, if you look at the left axis, what we have is the size of the organization starting at small, and it could going up to large. And then if you look at this x-axis here, then what you have is these are the age of the organization starting off at young and going up to mature. Okay, and as you might imagine, there's a correlation between the size of the organization and the age of the organization, since organizations tend to get bigger over time, at least the ones that survive. Now, what we're going to talk about here are the different stages of growth. So the very, very, very early stages here is we're calling creativity. And then there's going to be different crises. And the different crises is a transition period between one stage and the next stage. Okay, so this first stage is all about creativity. And then there's a crisis of leadership, which leads to a slightly bigger organization. And then we have the second stage, which is called the direction. And we grow further, and then we finally have a crisis of autonomy. And then we have a case where we have delegation. And it's where the founders have to step back a little bit. So the first phase is really all about pure creativity and what you might want to call almost chaos. The second stage is about finding your footing and growing. And then finally in this, or not finally, but in this third stage, you have delegation. In other words, you have to impose some kind of management structure on your organization as it grows. Big literature in sociology on this. Very, very difficult to have an organization grow in an uncoordinated fashion. And so you end up with a crisis of control eventually. And then you move on to the next phase, which is the coordination phase, getting much bigger. And then you turn into some kind of bureaucracy. And that's where the red tape crisis comes from. And then you are in a stage of collaboration in a much more mature company. So what you see here is that the company starts off very small and very disorganized, I would say. And then over time, as the company grows, there are certain kinds of organizational structures and controls that need to be imposed to be able to handle the growth. Here's another way of thinking about this. This slide is focusing on the early stages of the team, of the company. And basically what you can see on this slide is that we're starting with the business idea here on the left. And then we're going to, over time, progress. So, there's just going to be an idea at first. That will turn into a business plan. And then the company will be founded. And then the company is more well established. So this is a time progression. Now, if you think about this in terms of the human resource development, one of the ideas here is that you have to be sort of a jack of all trades at first. We call it a decathlete. And then, over time, you specialize a little bit, and so the founders become, instead of decathletes, they become pentathletes. And the other team members are more like the triathletes. And then eventually, the founders are triathletes, and everyone else is a specialist. So over time, again, consistent with the prior page, there is a specialization aspect once the company is growing. And that's down here too, under the organizational development. We start out with a so-called one-man show, one-woman show. And that might turn into a few people. And then we have the functional division of labor. And then finally, we have increasing institutionalization and specialization. Okay? And if you think about tacit knowledge that's hard to describe and codify. Tacit knowledge is only in the heads of the founders at the very early stage. That's what the little F's are for. And eventually, the tacit knowledge is shared because you can learn by doing with the team. And then finally, what happens is after a while, you get into some routines, and those routines actually help you exploit your knowledge. That's why they call it's codified and stored in routines. So basically the idea here is that there's a progression over time, starting with the business idea and this very chaotic organization, and then as the organization grows, things become more regimented and routine-based, and people become more specialized. And that's normal. So continuing on where we left off, we're talking about this sort of progression between the small startup company and the large scaled up business. And so we want to contrast here two different types of organization. The first one is what we call the organic structure, and the second one's more hierarchical structure. And so just to give you a little bit, you're probably in the organic structure right now. That's at the very early stages. When the founders dominate the venture, there's a big focus on product development, market development. There's not a lot of managerial tasks, delegation, etc., since people trying to do multiple tasks. This is sort of the decathlete that we talked about last time. And then, we have a lot of informal communication, which increases creativity, and there's sort of a network type control. It's not like sort of a boss telling you what to do, but more everyone's doing their own thing, and we all talk to each other, and that's the way. And we are accountable to each other somehow as a group. And then as the business matures, inevitably, it almost has to move toward a hierarchical structure. I'm not saying it's impossible to leave it this way, but it's kind of hard to manage a company that's growing rapidly once it gets to a certain size without delegation and some kind of hierarchical structure. So what does that mean? It means we have specialists focusing on product development, on production, on marketing, et cetera, all the different functions of a company. We have more formal processes, trying to write things down more and say, what does a job description look like? And, how does your salary work and your bonus system, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of continuous monitoring and improvement of internal information flow. So instead of just having a chaotic information flow, we try and structure the information flow so that we can communicate in a more efficient manner. And then there's well-defined control. That basically means there's more of a sort of a supervisor subordinate type relationship where I'm the employee and you're the boss, and you basically negotiate with me about what tasks I should work on. Then I prove to you that I'm actually doing the thing. So you're controlling, in some sense. So what you have here is the inevitable move toward a hierarchical structure. Now, of course, having a hierarchical structure too early on in the venture is also not good, right? It's most people would consider it to be kind of an impediment to creativity. And on the other hand, hanging on to an organic structure after the company's gotten very, very big is also very problematic, because then you start running into a lot of efficiency problems and it makes it hard to scale. So what kind of problems can you expect when you are in your growth phase? And typically what that means is, you're hiring people, your market's expanding, you get a lot more customers coming in. So basically you're scaling, as we discussed, and that sounded great at the time, a few slides ago. But now, when we think about the downsides of this, there's a lot of things to watch out for here. So, the first is that your tools, your controlling tools, which is usually word of mouth and network control, as we mentioned before, they're insufficient to handle a larger number of employees and a larger number of tasks and specialists. So the information flows become too complex, because if everyone's communicating to everybody and you have some specialists but no one is really clearly making decisions because you're in kind of startup mode, the information flows become too complex to actually use. Management becomes too overloaded. Okay, and we say there's running the business, focusing on operative business. The span of supervision is too large. So in other words, a span of control is basically when one supervisor is in charge of multiple employees. That's the span, how many. And if that becomes too big because there are too many things going on at once, then it becomes very, very difficult to supervise. It can lead to a bottleneck when you're making decisions. For example, if every single decision has to go all the way up to the founder, and your company is growing rapidly and there are lots of decisions coming in day to day, it can actually overwhelm the founder or whoever, or the supervisor in some other cases. That leads you to push away all the strategic thinking that you need to do, and you're just focusing on the day-to-day, and that becomes very, very, very difficult to handle. So that leads to the overwork of the team, and whenever you have overwork is good in the short term. Feeling like you're under a deadline pressure is nice, but continuous burnout can lead to frustration, loss of motivation. And finally, the tasks originally defined by individuals and their personality. I'm good at this, I should do this, and not by the job description. And eventually you need to somehow decide on the different jobs for the specialists. And in case there's a fluctuation, the original plan of having everyone do everything and basing your tasks on your personality becomes very, very difficult, because you might need to shift what people are working on. And it's better to, in the case of a growing company, to define the job description. So basically what we're talking about here is moving toward a more managerial type company as opposed to a founder type company. So just getting back to the stages of growth model, I think what you can see here is that this is sort of the optimal way of dealing with scale. And as I mentioned before, keeping this model when your company is, very, very large is not a very, very efficient way to run a company. And you really need to move in the direction of the more managed. This is the founder part. This is the founder dominated part of the graph. And, up here is the more managerial part. So you can switch from a founder orientation to a managerial orientation. Again, keeping a large company with a small company's organization structure is not very useful, and likewise, having a large structure for a small company is also not efficient at all, and it's too rigid. So basically, what we see here is there's inevitable bumps in the road, and so what you need to think about here is eventually, if you have this happy problem, you're going to grow to a certain size over time, and that there are going to be bumps on the road on the way. They have to do with different aspects of making a transition to a more structured organization. And you can read the Greiner, we'll put a link to it on our site. You can read the Greiner book for all the different details of the different crises. There are going to be certain crises over time, and there are going to be reorganizations over time. But in the end, this is a much more efficient way of organizing to handle a large company that has a large volume of sales. So that's it for 5.4. What we're going to do next is a little summary of this whole module. So stay with us.